The Sherlock Holmes Advent Calendar. The Redeemer's Coming, by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Nora Godwin. Narrated by Peter Silverleaf. 19. Confessions of a Dead Man. When I was on my way with Holmes to inspect the lab, we discovered, in more detail, we were surprisingly stopped. Reverend Blake from Teddington approached us and greeted me almost exuberantly. "Ah, Dr. Watson," he shouted, beaming with joy, hugging me. "I've been looking for you." Then he turned to Holmes and said, "And you have to be this detective, this famous Mr. Holmes, Sherlock Holmes," my friend quickly added, reaching out to the old priest. "Oh, yes, very pleased," he replied. "I am the Reverend Thomas Blake of the Church of St. Mary of Teddington." "I know," Holmes replied. "Dr. Watson told me about you. Welcome to Twickenham. How long have you been here?" "Oh, for about an hour," said the priest. "But at first it was essential to bring the good Harry back to his home stables, and then I had to wait for my old friend, Brother Francis. But enough of me. What about your investigation? I hope you have now made further progress." "Absolutely, Father," I said, "but we don't want to bore you with criminal details. To sum up, we are close on the perpetrator's heels. You could even say we are driving him into the corner. It is quite possible that he will soon give up on his own." I knew, of course, that this assessment was a little optimistic, but I didn't want to burden the Reverend any further. It seemed more reasonable to me to weigh him to safety. After all, who wants to be a guest in a monastery where a murderer is running free? "I am glad to hear that," the priest replied promptly, "because I already had a bit of a queasy feeling when I entered the Abbey." Then he pulled out a bottle of brandy under his coat, just like he did in Teddington, and smiled kindly. "Actually, I hoped we could sit down and share one or two glasses, but I don't want to stop you from doing your job." "That's fine," Holmes said immediately. "Just have a drink. I'll be fine on my own for the time being." "Are you sure?" I asked suspiciously. But Holmes reiterated his statement with a nod, declaring, "I solved cases before I knew you, my dear Watson. Trust me, I know what I'm doing." With these words, Holmes left us in the direction of the secret laboratory, aiming for direct access through the washrooms. I retreated with Reverend Blake to the otherwise orphaned dining-room, where we immediately opened the bottle. "You were three," the priest said as he poured two glasses. "What about the Inspector of Scotland Yard, Mr. Lestat?" "His name is Lestrade," I corrected with a smile. "As far as I know, he's currently on the roof to fix it. Apparently the storm has loosened some roof tiles." "I understand," said the Reverend, and emptied his glass. I emptied my glass as well and decided to trust him. "Maybe we can talk about the case briefly, if you don't mind," I began. "Any time," the priest replied candidly. "Well," I continued, "you have to know the matter has gotten much worse. Someone in this monastery undertakes medical experiments, perhaps genetic experiments, with the holy blood relic of this monastery." The Reverend was astonished. "You mean with the supposed blood of Jesus Christ?" he asked. "This is undoubtedly a forgery, don't you think so?" "Probably," I confirmed, "but that's what it's all about. Crucially, the perpetrator believes in the authenticity of the blood, and now he may have injected it into himself or someone else to resurrect the spirit of the Messiah." "Oh, that's crazy," the old priest replied. "I understand many things, and I am also a proven friend of ecumenism, but sometimes when I look at our friends from the Roman Catholic Church in this way, I inevitably come to the conclusion that these Romans are crazy." I looked around demonstratively and said, "Psst." Then we both started laughing, and I poured two more glasses of brandy. "Of course, the mental state of the perpetrator is of importance," I began anew, "but the transitions have no boundaries. It's highly possible that we are dealing with a religious zealot, a real fanatic. Catholics are indeed highly vulnerable to this, as I recently learned in a conversation about the devotion to Mary." "Certainly," the Reverend replied mildly, "but we do not address the weak point of our fellows, but show tolerance and leniency." "But my indulgence has come to an end," I replied. "This is about a double murder, and that's why I wanted to ask you, Father. You have known this Abbey for a long time. Who do you think would be capable of such an act?" "Sorry, Doctor," my counterpart replied without thinking. "As I told you, I haven't been here for some time. A good part of the friars is now unknown to me. I am a priest, not a psychiatrist." "But what about Brother Peter, the vicar?" I asked anyway. "He is a strange person. I would not put anything past him. He acts too secretively and unpredictably." The Reverend smiled. "It's no secret," he said in a calm voice, "that Brother Peter and I are not exactly best friends, but I respect him. In this respect, it would be very difficult for me to suspect him." I had to acknowledge that Reverend Blake would not make any accusations. How could I assume that such a good shepherd would stoop so low as to denunciate someone? I nodded. We clinked glasses and emptied them again in one go. Before we would resume the conversation, Brother Paul suddenly arrived. Because of his obesity, he was completely out of breath and could hardly speak at first. With both arms, he had to support himself on the tabletop right next to us. "Dr. Watson," he stammered. I got up immediately and carefully put my hand on his back. "Calm down, Brother Paul," I said in a gentle tone. "Breathe slowly, deeply, and exhale again. Very good." And then it broke out of Brother Paul. "Dr. Watson," he repeated excitedly, "you have to come quickly. Something terrible has happened." I reacted immediately. "Then let's go," I shouted, and energetically pushed the poor friar. "Run! You can breathe later." Brother Paul trotted away, and I stayed on his heels, while the Reverend followed a little more leisurely with a little distance. Soon I thought he was leading me into the chapel, and that was where he ran. When we stopped at the door, Brother Paul was on the verge of a physical collapse and had to be supported by a colleague, and I was absolutely certain that the next murder must have happened. Suddenly a thought crossed my head. Holmes! Had he become the third victim of the perpetrator? I started blaming myself for leaving him alone. 6 friars had gathered around the entrance with stony faces barely able to look into my eyes. I didn't dare go through the gate. How could I be so reckless and leave my friend when he was about to find the last secrets of the perpetrator? It had been perfectly logical that the next deadly attack had to be done to the ingenious investigator. I would never forgive myself for not having prevented this. And then I thought of Holmes's own overestimation. He always pretended to be invulnerable, even immortal, and now his recklessness had cost him his life. I took a deep breath and gathered all my courage to enter the chapel and make sure that my fears had not come to life. But then a hand was placed on my shoulder from behind, and an all-too-familiar voice asked, "What's going on here?" I quickly turned around and shouted, "Holmes, thank God, you're alive." "As far as I can judge, yes," my so very alive friend replied. "But Watson, do tell me what is going on here." Before I had to admit that I had no idea, Brother Francis stepped out of the chapel. "Finally you are here, gentlemen," he shouted in our direction. "Come on, you should see for yourself." We followed the abbot through the gate, as did Reverend Blake, who had finally caught up with me. Inside the chapel, our eyes were immediately drawn to the big crucifix with the suffering Messiah hanging directly behind, or rather above, the altar. There, on the crossbeam, dangled a lifeless human body. It was Brother Peter. Apparently, he had hung himself with the rope of his own cowl. "Get him down fast," I shouted to the monks behind us, who immediately took action. "Don't try, Doctor," Brother Francis said resignedly. "Any medical help is too late." The monks detached the rope from the crucifix and carefully laid the vicar's body on the ground. Within seconds I realized that the abbot was right. "I can't do anything for him any more," I confirmed. "He's dead." "And so the traitor died by his own hand," Brother Francis commented. "A tragic end, but Satan had taken possession of him." With these words he handed Holmes a piece of paper which was handwritten with a few lines. "What is that?" I asked. "A farewell letter?" "And a confession," Holmes replied, reading aloud. "May the Lord forgive me, for I have sinned. The guilt I have inflicted on myself is unbearable. Because of my sins 2 of my brothers died violently. I have set fire to the house of God. I have desecrated the blood of Christ. Now I'm paying for it with my own life. Mea culpa, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. May the Lord be gracious to my soul." "Succinct, but unambiguous," I said. "That's where we have our perpetrator. He has judged himself." "Is that surely Brother Peter's handwriting?" Holmes asked the abbot. Brother Francis nodded wordlessly as a confirmation, and then said dejectedly, "Who could have guessed this? You don't know your own brother. I would never have suspected the perpetrator in Brother Peter. My closest collaborator, my deputy, a nefarious murderer." "Intransparent and unpredictable," I muttered softly. Reverend Blake stepped next to the abbot and patted his old friend on the shoulder. "Don't take this at heart," he said. "The most important thing is that the horror has ended. Now peace can return to the Abbey, and you have to be strong now. Your brothers need you. The convent needs you. You still have a lot of work to do. I will stay here until tomorrow and stand by you." "Thank you, Thomas," replied the abbot. "You are a good friend." Then Brother Francis finally addressed Holmes and me. "Thank you for your investigation. After all, it may be due to your progress that Brother Peter felt compelled to give up. You will probably regret the fact that he no longer has to answer to any secular judgment, but now the no less harsh judgment of God awaits him. Nevertheless, your work here is done. It is time to say goodbye. Come back to my office before you leave for London."